Hi, this is Tom Bodette. 20 years ago, my curious nature brought me to new frontiers. Well, now I'm heading out to track the journeys of earlier Americans who followed their own curious natures on America's historic trails. In 1682, William Penn sailed up the Delaware River, stopping at settlements along the way, and finally choosing this site for what would be called his holy experiment. Like Europeans who came before him, Penn would organize a colony, but he would welcome people of all religions. Citizens of every persuasion could worship freely without fear of being jailed. As weird as it sounds now, that was still a radical idea. The result of Penn's master plan was Philadelphia. Eager souls streamed into this fast-growing city, and then for 150 years, just as many blazed the trail out. First by foot, and then by horse, wagon, or stagecoach, thousands migrated west to create new lives in the heart of Pennsylvania and the valleys of Virginia. They carved a rugged, mud-packed, and wheel-rutted highway that came to be Philadelphia's Great Wagon Road. We're going to follow the path of the old wagon road and trace the steps of those single-minded pilgrims. We'll start with Philadelphia and her earliest settlers, then drive west through Amish country, and turn south to cross the Potomac River at Harper's Ferry. We'll find remnants of the growing pains of a nation and try to imagine life during the Civil War with its terrible battles and haunting legacy. Exploring along the route, we'll find a 19th century marketplace, eat lunch at a restored stagecoach inn, and tour a poignant battlefield. Certainly those who founded Philadelphia could hardly imagine what they'd set in motion on the banks of the Delaware. William Penn tried his ideas on a big scale. For years in England, he'd had to defend himself and other Quakers against the Crown, who jailed them for their beliefs. By the time he arrived here, he had money, ambition, and purpose. His colony became a sort of promised land, and by 1700, thousands of immigrants eager to share Penn's dream had arrived at this waterfront. Philadelphia landmarks from the 1700s stand as a colony's pledge to religious tolerance and the faith that would guide thousands west on the old wagon road. Even before Penn's first visit here, Swedish immigrants were worshiping near the site of the Gloria Dei Church. Presbyterians still pray in one of the city's original colonial churches, and Christ Church honors the founding fathers who attended there, like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin. Early on, Jews were part of the community. Mikveh Israel Cemetery was opened in 1740. Quakers created several meeting houses, this largest one built in 1804. And from the start, the colony accepted Catholics. In 1733, small St. Joseph's Church was built on a back alley lot and without religious identification. Roman Catholics, barred from public worship in England and the other colonies, approached Philadelphia's promise of religious liberty with caution. But the city's legacy of brotherly love prevailed, and only 30 years later, spacious St. Mary's Church was built. Along with his religious ideals, Penn brought solid plans for the physical design of the colony as well, and he expected to turn a profit. He offered newcomers up to 5,000 acres. Most immigrants left their homes in search of land as well as freedom, so word of Penn's philosophy spread, and in 1682 alone, 23 ships of new settlers followed him to Pennsylvania. Within a few years, the colony was 4,000 strong. City Hall was built on the site originally designed by Penn as an open square in the center of town.
William Penn conceived of Philadelphia as a green country town. It was laid out in a rigid grid pattern reflecting Renaissance ideas of city planning with 5 public squares, one in the center where City Hall now stands, in which in fact Penn had designated as a place for buildings for public concerns.
300 years later, the green country town with its large lots is gone. But the squares and grid plans still shape Philadelphia much as Penn envisioned.
Too commonly, William Penn is looked upon as a modern man, as one of the fathers of the American Constitution, for example. I prefer to think of William Penn, I think he's better understood as a late 17th century dissenter English gentleman. Nothing more, nothing less than that. It's time, I think, to forget about William Penn as an icon, and understanding him better, take him off the top of City Hall.
Understanding Penn better comes with a tour of historic estates in Philadelphia's Germantown. Its 18th century buildings are for real, not reconstructed, and their stories are for real. Like the Johnson House, which once sheltered slaves fleeing north in the shadows of the old Wagon Road. Considered the countryside in Penn's day, Germantown is another diverse Philadelphia neighborhood, and its country estates are kept up in the historic section of town. The Stanton Place shows a Conestoga wagon that survived the great old road. Elegant Cliveden House gives few clues that it was the site of a battle, which George Washington lost to the British before retreating to Valley Forge. The estates in the Germantown neighborhood show what Penn had wanted for all of Philadelphia. When William Penn sailed in here 3 centuries ago, he took a walk and had a couple ales at a tavern down by the docks. Then he made a come on as far as this, Alfrith Alley. Today, the dressmaker's house is a museum. In 1740, the neighbors would have included blacksmiths and boat builders. Tradespeople rented and worked in these row houses, just blocks from the dock. The surviving buildings range from 140 years to over 250 years old. Remarkably, they've been lived in steadily since they were built and rebuilt along the way. At the time Alfrith Alley was busy, this head house square market throbbed with shoppers and merchants who displayed fresh produce, meats, fish, and bread. Well, in those days, it was the new market, built for grateful neighbors who'd been trudging the 4 rut-filled muddy blocks to Market Street to do their shopping. Across town, Reading Railroad Terminal Market continues to provide fresh goods and great home-cooked food, just as it did 200 years ago when farmers hauled produce over the old Wagon Road into this market. Independence Hall represents the phenomenal growth before the Revolution, when Penn's experimental city had become a gateway to the colonies and a major hub of intellectual life. Both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were signed here. As the city grew, so did its influence, wealth, cost of living, and pollution. Well, as Philadelphia filled out, more and more of its residents left here and headed west, looking for land and clean air. You know, it's not hard to imagine the old Wagon Road jammed with people and horses, cows, and every kind of conveyance as they lumbered off into the wild. It's still a busy highway, and by the end of colonial times, it was the most traveled road in all America, the main route for westward expansion. Today, following the old Wagon Road out of Philadelphia means taking Lancaster Pike west, where a minor detour leads to a sobering event in the American Revolution. Manicured as it is on the Schuylkill River, Valley Forge still gives a sense of desolation. In the cold December of 1777, George Washington brought his bedraggled Continental Army troops here for the winter after fighting 2 major battles. With only a few skilled craftsmen, they started building shelter. One soldier wrote, "Have one dull axe to build a log hut. When it will be done, I know not." Within a month, most of them were housed, 12 to a cabin. 2,000 of them died from sickness and freezing weather. Some talked mutiny, others deserted. But the 11,000 who stayed were fiercely loyal to their general, George Washington.
This house dates back to 1768. 80% of this house, as you see it today, is original. That's not reproduced or redesigned or refurbished. It's original. So you're seeing this house even to the color of the paint that Washington saw when he rents this home for a 6-month period of time from the owners. And he moves his staff to between 20 and 25 people in here. And then Martha Washington comes up in early February and she stays here, as she did all 8 years of the campaign, no matter where the Army was during the wintertime. Because Washington takes no leave or pay for his service to the country for those 8 years.
Immigrants heading west on this wagon road mostly focused on farming or trade, but some saw lucrative ways to serve settlers by becoming ferrymen, wagon builders, or innkeepers.
Being an innkeeper pretty much had the same responsibilities today as you did 250 years ago, which was to provide a nice warm meal and a comfortable, safe accommodations for overnight stay, and of course a nice beverage to end the day. Nothing much has changed except maybe some of the ingredients used and of course the price. This particular facility, the General Warren, was a toll plaza, tavern, inn, restaurant, mail relay, in addition to also having a blacksmith shop, and down by an old pond that's no longer there, stables for the covered wagons and the horses.
Since 1745, the General Warren Inn in Malvern, Pennsylvania, has been a stop for tired and hungry travelers on the old wagon road. A short detour south takes us to the Brandywine Valley. Longwood Gardens includes 1,000 acres once owned and landscaped by Pierre S. DuPont. It's no surprise that these gardens were a playground for 1920s high society. In 1906, DuPont purchased the property from a Quaker farm family, and he built his improvements around the original 18th century mansion. Today, the formal grounds, children's garden, and amphitheater offer paying visitors a quiet place to walk. The road out of the gardens leads us next door to a different kind of reflection. In 1830, long before the Civil War, Longwood Quaker Meeting House was a hotbed of abolitionism. Getting caught aiding a fugitive slave meant a $1,000 fine and 6 months in jail. But the progressive branch of the Quakers persevered. They'd spirit him away right under the noses of informers and slave hunters who knew what was going on but couldn't prove anything. Obeying what they believed to be higher laws than man's energized these Quakers and other brave citizens to take great risks. Before and during the Civil War, the old wagon road was a key route for thousands of fugitive slaves heading north. Francis Cloud Taylor wrote, "A hurried whisper, a furtive glance, the rattle of a stick along a pale fence at midnight. These were signs that the Underground Railroad was in operation.
They hated slavery, and they would do anything they could to defy this law. Not all Quakers were abolitionists, but the members who did believe in freeing the slaves were very dedicated to their beliefs.
Often relying on dead reckoning or the North Star, slaves traveled a secret network of paths, stopping at safe houses or stations.
This was the home of Dr. Edwin Fussell, one of the leading abolitionists in the Kennett Square area. He helped hundreds of slaves and hid them in his root cellar. Slaves would come probably in the middle of the night and would be kept overnight until it was safe the following night, when they would be taken to the next station.
From Fussell's root cellar, they would crawl through a tunnel, come up in a shallow well, and emerge after dark, waiting for a signal to silently press on, risking all for freedom. Nearby, Longwood Meeting House honors the Underground Railroad and the abolitionists who came here to speak out against slavery. Quaker Thomas Garrett would enthrall crowds of troubled citizens who gathered, as would Susan B. Anthony and fiery Lucretia Mott. Eloquent fugitive slave Frederick Douglass argued here, and ex-slave Sojourner Truth. Harriet Tubman, who lived nearby, saved over 300 slaves. She said, "There are two things I've got a right to, death or liberty." Longwood Cemetery pays tribute to the courageous local participants, or conductors, in the Underground Railroad. The Great Wagon Road became a road to freedom for all sorts of people. Driving into Lancaster County, we see the legacy of other religious groups. In the early 1700s, many poor and oppressed Germans packed up and flooded into Pennsylvania. They wore the dark clothes of Protestant pilgrims. The Amish, Mennonites, Moravians, Lutherans, and Seventh-day Adventists. Their speech evolved into a dialect of English and German, or Deutsch, which is today called Pennsylvania Dutch. Only 66 miles from Philadelphia, Lancaster County seems a world apart from our modern problems, or from Quaker activism. The Amish and the Mennonite take care of their own. Living in simple and productive farm communities, they continue to cling to their fundamental traditions.
Welcome to the Amish Farming House. This is an authentic Amish home, except for the electricity. We do have the consent of the Amish to show you how they live. Amish are followers of a man by the name of Jacob Ammon. He was a Mennonite bishop in Switzerland. In 1693, he and his followers felt the Mennonites were getting too worldly, so they left the Mennonite group in Switzerland and went to the Rhine Valley of Germany, where they remained till William Penn invited them here. Those left back in Europe died out. Our Amish are doubling their population every 20 years. It is a growing society. And this is the group we're talking about. They're called Old Order House Amish. They're called that because they don't have churches or temples, but they take turns having the church service right in their home. In the home, they speak German. Very few children speak English till they go to school. All religion is taught by the parents around the kitchen table, and they only have an 8th grade education. Amish do not believe in further education. Their children only go to the end of 8th grade or the age of 14, whichever comes first.
For tourists, non-Amish merchants offer buggy rides and tours about this way of life in Lancaster and the nearby villages. Both the Amish and Mennonites are superb farmers and friendly and helpful in selling their produce at markets. The Central Market in Lancaster is like an old-fashioned county fair. Our final visit in Amish country is Strasburg. In the 1850s, these short line railroads began to appear, and this is America's oldest. Today, a steam locomotive chugs leisurely through rolling farmland, pulling tourists 5 miles before turning around in the village of Paradise. Well, in the 1700s, it took about a day and a half to get from Lancaster to York. Today, we can do it in less than an hour. In historic York, our wagon road has become a smooth 2-lane route right down Market Street. Congress suddenly landed here in 1777 to hammer out the Articles of Confederation.
We're in the Colonial Courthouse. This is where Congress came after fleeing the British in Philadelphia on the old Wagon Road. They spent about 9 months here finishing up the articles and signing them. That's why we considered York the first capital of the United States.
Across the street, reflecting 100 years of change, these restored 18th century buildings are joined together. You can almost hear the constitutional arguments in the old tavern and smell fresh bread baking in the kitchen. As we head west and south from York, we leave colonial arguments behind and plunge into memories of another conflict that would forever change our country, the Civil War. The old Wagon Road takes us on to the battlefields of Gettysburg and the bloodiest battle of all. On 3 humid days in July 1863, more men fought and died here than in any other battle on American soil. 51,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing in those 3 days. The array of cannons, statues, and fields spell out the battle in heart-wrenching detail.
You look at the woods around and how these people came out of these woods yelling and screaming. And it just must have been very fearful, and that's what I get out of it. And the loss of life is just unbelievable.
I'm pretty close to the spot where President Abraham Lincoln dedicated this, the Gettysburg National Cemetery, just 4 months after the battle. The speech only lasted 2 minutes, but the words he spoke redefined our nation. On our way to Harper's Ferry, we've stopped in Frederick, a town in Maryland that celebrates its past, and we happened into town on Frederick's 250th birthday party, an all-American gala in the park. Confederate soldiers once marched through here on their way to the killing fields of Antietam. General Stonewall Jackson was moved that day by the tenacity of a local woman. As his troops marched past Barbara Fritchie's house, one of them shot at her Union flag. John Whittier's poem describes her leaning out the window and snatching the piece of silk. "Shoot if you must this old gray head, but spare your country's flag," she said. A blushing Jackson spared both. Leaving the spires of Frederick behind, we travel south to the Potomac River and more living history. Harper's Ferry and fiery abolitionist John Brown came to symbolize the agonizing struggle to free the slaves.
John Brown would actually come to Harper's Ferry in the year 1859 to launch a raid against slavery itself in an attempt to destroy it from its foundation up. This would be Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Virginia was the largest slaveholding state in the Union during that time period. So John Brown felt that with its proximity to larger farms and plantations in the South and its proximity in the North, using some of his strategic plans, he hoped to destroy it, capture the weapons from the Harper's Ferry gun factory, send slaves to freedom in the North, and destroy the slavery institution as he went farther south.
The military raid failed miserably, and John Brown was hanged for treason. His death created the martyr the cause of freedom needed. The tracks of the Great Wagon Road still run deep in the bedrock of this country. Next time, we'll track the Wilderness Road through Virginia and Kentucky in the west. From the vision of William Penn to the horrors of Antietam and Harper's Ferry, the sacrifices of the settlers and the soldiers who came this way remains an awesome legacy to a modern and still free American like myself. I'm Tom Bodette, and thanks for joining us on America's Historic Trails. Hi, this is Tom Bodette. 20 years ago, my curious nature brought me to new frontiers. Well, now I'm heading out to track the journeys of earlier Americans who followed their own curious natures on America's historic trails. Well, here's the big picture on the old Wilderness Road. Daniel Boone usually gets the credit for hacking it through the mountains, but at first it was an Indian trail, and a few explorers had used it years before to travel deep into Virginia and Kentucky territories. This trail has seen over 200 years of battles and changing landscapes as it lured settlers into the wild heart of America. As the colonies became crowded and costly, the Wilderness Road became a promising route westward. We'll join its well-worn path south of the Potomac River in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley and follow Daniel Boone's cut through the Cumberland Gap and on to Louisville. We're heading up the valley between the imposing Alleghenies on one side and beautiful Blue Ridge Parkway on the other. 300 years of history are stamped into a 500-mile stretch of road through Virginia to Kentucky. We'll imagine travel along this road before Route 11 covered up the old footpaths and wagon wheel ruts. We'll visit a 17th century farmhouse, a 19th century Shaker community, and an Indian trail that became the thoroughfare through the Appalachians. Well, driving along Route 11 today, it's hard to imagine that the Shenandoah Valley was ever wild or dangerous and impassable. But in fact, in 1750, you could only make 10 miles a day by horse or wagon, and that was on a good day. It was the hard-bitten and the desperate who ventured west, explorers carving mountain trails, farmers thirsty for land, and religious groups seeking a place to worship freely. It's just another highway today, but as early as 1650, this route was called the Great Warrior's Path. For centuries, it had served as a trade corridor and a battleground for the Iroquois people. But their world was decimated as newcomers boldly settled in and took charge. Battlefields are common on this old trail. For 200 years, off and on, this area remained a battle site for settlers and their descendants as well. We're stopping at Belgrove Plantation, just north of Strasburg, Virginia, where the grounds embody the old aristocracy of the South. The story of Belgrove peaked during the Civil War, when its nearby fields were bloodied in the Battle of Cedar Creek, one of the most dramatic episodes of that war. The Battle of Cedar Creek was fought here on October 19, 1864, and Philip Sheridan used Belgrove Plantation as his field headquarters.
He kept his signal corps in the attic here, and he was surprised that early morning, about 5:30, by Jubal Early's Confederate troops. Philip Sheridan happened to be in Winchester, heard about the battle, rushed down, rallied his troops, and of course ended up winning the day.
Now it's a 100-acre working farm owned by the National Trust for Historical Preservation. Nearby Strasburg sprung up 50 years earlier as France and England battled over the territory. Both sides were bribing Indians to scare off the settlers, so farmers moved closer together for safety and built this town in the 1750s. Finally, in 1763, the French ceded their land rights to the English. Although hostilities lingered, most fighting stopped and the westward bound settlers took new heart. By the time of the Civil War, countless thousands of people had crossed the Potomac into Virginia. And little by little, the roads were improving. Virginia Cadden of Strasburg's Town Museum explains how the farmers helped out.
Farmers were delighted to know that they would get the fantastic sum of $10 for one load of stone that they already had to pick up from their fields and bring it to the site, dump it, and then take their own hammers and break the rocks into gravel for surfacing the road.
Leaving historic Strasburg behind, we've detoured to the Blue Ridge Parkway and a natural wonder. The Luray Caverns are unique. They extend for miles and were unknown to non-natives until 1878. That's when some locals set out to find a cave to promote as a tourist attraction.
William Campbell discovered a small opening between two limestone rocks and felt cool air rushing out, and this indicated an underground opening. So the three began very excitedly clearing away the rock and debris, and after about 5 hours, Andrew Campbell was lowered down into the entrance chamber of Luray Caverns. The stalactite organ was developed by Mr. Leland W. Sprinkle, who was an electronics engineer from nearby Springfield, Virginia. Mr. Sprinkle, knowing that the stalactites themselves could be used to produce a musical tone because of their crystalline structure and their rigidity, developed this organ over a 3-year period. He used English tuning forks and tested thousands of stalactites by gently tapping them with little rubber-tipped mallets to see if the tone would match the tuning fork.
Well, it took a while, but ultimately he found hundreds of musical notes scattered over 3.5 acres of the cavern, and he created the stalactite organ, the largest natural musical instrument in the world. We're headed to Stanton and a reenactment of frontier life on the Wilderness Road. Although native peoples had lived in this country for 10 or 20,000 years, for the newcomers, this was the frontier. Gradually, these settlers were creating a unique American culture, a blend of old country values and new influences. Virginia descendants and fresh bands of pioneers continued down the Wilderness Road, branching off or settling along the way. They built houses like those they left behind. The Museum of the American Frontier in Stanton interprets this developing scene with authentic farms moved here from Europe. They bring to life images these settlers must have carried in their hearts and their minds.
Spinning flax, which is what makes linen. using the spinning wheel, and it twists all the fibers that are up here into thread, which gets spun around or twisted, spun and onto the bobbin down there. Something the Germans did. They wore a lot of linen because it's something you can just plant in your fields, spend your winter months making clothes out of.
Welcome to our Shenandoah Valley farm. Our time period here is 1860. Yesterday was Sunday, and we had visitors coming, so I fixed quite a nice meal. Potatoes, cabbage, and pork, because the ham was left from yesterday's dinner. We're having a nice treat today.
Ornery draft horses, drafty farmhouses, spinning cloth and hunting game for supper. These were daily challenges on the Wilderness Road. Continuing south, the town of Lexington reminds us of Civil War days and Stonewall Jackson's warning. If this valley is lost, Virginia is lost. The stately-looking community was a 19th century college town and appears to be a retirement haven for generals. Here is the only home Stonewall Jackson ever owned. An historic cemetery on the edge of town honors Jackson, and Washington and Lee University holds services in the Lee Chapel, built by the college president himself, Robert E. Lee. It's also home to Virginia Military Institute, where cadets study a Civil War battle of their VMI predecessors.
On May 11th in 1864, the Corps was called on by General Breckinridge to fight in the Battle of Newmarket. Actually, they weren't going to fight then. They were just called up as reinforcements. So the Corps marched for 3 days up to Newmarket. When they reached the battle, they were laughed at by the Confederate soldiers because all these young boys between 16 and 18 years of age were up there. A charge led by the VMI cadets broke the northern line and turned the tide of the battle. There are 10 cadets that were killed. 6 of those cadets are buried on post, and 47 others were injured. We are the only college in the nation that has ever fought as a college, and so it's a tradition that we hold very, very proud.
Centuries of soldiers have witnessed the impressive sights along this route. The natural bridge is 23 stories high, and the Wilderness Road we're following crossed over it at one time, just as Route 11 does today. Before Europeans arrived, the Monacan native peoples held the bridges sacred and worshipped here. For Thomas Jefferson, it was the most sublime of nature's work, and he just had to have it. So he purchased the bridge from England and owned it for 50 years. Well, in the spirit of Jefferson, the bridge is still privately owned. You have to pay to see it. Leaving that natural wonder behind, we're on our way to colorful Abingdon, 150 miles south. At the foot of the Shenandoah, this rural junction of Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky has known travelers from Daniel Boone to stagecoach riders to Civil War soldiers. Early on, Abingdon was strategic for settlers as a refueling stop on the Wilderness Road that headed into Kentucky. We were there in time to catch a country fair. Ferris wheels and country living are a part of the territory in southern Virginia. But long before county fairs, taverns were the meeting spots. Well, this tavern is the oldest building in town. Built in 1779 as a stagecoach stop, it was a place where travelers could depend on a bed and a hot meal, and where the locals would gather around to catch up on news from the outside world. And if he's not too busy, owner Max Herman will show you around the historic tavern. At times during the Civil War, it was also a hospital with Union and Confederate soldiers lying wounded next to each other. Today, in its tradition of serving hungry travelers, the tavern still prepares good food in a well-run kitchen. It's a short walk from the tavern to one of America's oldest theaters.
Barter Theater is in many ways a miracle theater, an against the odds theater. And the people of this region certainly have embraced it for over 60 years and claimed it as its own. And I would think that the fierce independence and the ruggedness and the use of creative resources that we find here in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia has contributed to the success and longevity of the Barter Theater. Barter was founded in 1933 in the midst of the Depression by an enterprising young actor named Robert Porterfield. And he came to his native Washington County with an extraordinary proposition, which was exchanging food for admission to see a play. The concept of exchanging ham for Hamlet, as we called it, was literally an overnight success, almost an instant success. At the end of that very first season, during the Depression, the company cleared $2.35 in cash, a couple barrels of jelly, and a collective weight gain of over 300 pounds.
On the outskirts of Abingdon, they've been grinding corn and flour at this spot for 200 years. White's Mill shows no signs of slowing down. You can still buy their ground corn or buckwheat flour at the 100-year-old country store across the street. White's Mill, now on the National Historic Registry, probably survived because it's remote and because of Appalachian respect for tradition. It would be rude to leave Virginia without mentioning horses. The state's tradition of miniature horses, Arabian horses, and hunters and jumpers perseveres on farms, in the fields, and at a college riding center like Intermont. Here, students can earn a 4-year degree in horsemanship.
Okay? You can't think so much. Let the jump come to you. Don't chase it. Not necessary. All right? Let's easy. Good girl. Now, Allison, back to the trot. Good.
The trail switches us to Route 58 west, heading straight to Cumberland Gap, the touchstone of the Appalachians. Without a doubt, the Gap is key to the Wilderness Road, the route into Kentucky explored in 1769 by Daniel Boone and years later vastly improved under his guidance. It takes us to Cumberland National Park. Other adventurers had explored the backwoods through this gap 100 years before Daniel Boone did, but he remains the nation's quintessential frontier explorer. He once remarked, "Well, I can't say as ever I was lost, but I was bewildered once for 3 days."
Imagine what this area would have looked like prior to the arrival of white men. And there were large stands of chestnut trees and laurel thickets, hop vine trees and cane thickets. I mean, you just really had to hack your way through this region. This is a real small segment of the original wagon road on the Wilderness Road that was blazed by Daniel Boone and 30 axemen in 1775.
Once Daniel Boone opened up the narrow Indian footpath, hordes of settlers began the walk to Kentucky. It took up to 8 months to travel the 200 miles, and that meant surviving Indian attacks, an icy winter, rugged terrain, and endless catastrophe. Moses Austin, a prominent Virginian, couldn't believe his eyes as he watched families with no shoes and no supplies wading through the ice and the snow. He writes, "Ask these pilgrims what they expect when they get to Kentucky, and the answer is land. Have you any? No, but I expect I can get it. Have you anything to pay for land? No. Can anything be more absurd? Traveling hundreds of miles, they know not for what, except it's to Kentucky. Passing land almost as good and easy obtained. But it will not do. It's not Kentucky. It's not the promised land." Over 300,000 people took their chances on the Cumberland Gap before easier northern routes opened up. Today, Cumberland National Park preserves its past. You can visit a 19th century iron furnace and hike on a segment of the original trail. Driving north to Harrodsburg in central Kentucky, we're heading for the Shaker Village at Pleasant Hill. It's a perfect example of a religious group's struggle to worship in peace and a place to learn what Shakers believed.
The Shakers liked visitors in their church. Why? Because they were celibate. It was a little hard to grow and multiply without people joining. They hoped if people could just come and watch, maybe they would want to join. So these doors were open to the public then, just as they are today, and visitors flocked out to see the Shakers. Sometimes on Sunday afternoons, they would find over 1,000 visitors out there in the street.
There wasn't much preaching. People came to witness the religious trances, speaking in tongues, and the exuberant dancing or shaking. Randy ends with a popular Shaker hymn.
Well, today I want to share with you the original Shaker version right here in this room where they sang it all those years ago. Simple Gifts. 'Tis the gift to be simple, 'tis the gift to be free, 'tis the gift to come down where we ought to be. And when we find ourselves in the place just right, 'twill be in the valley of love and delight. To turn, turn will be our delight, till by turning, turning, we come round right.
The Shakers came to Kentucky in 1805. Their first permanent building was what we call the Farm Deacon Shop, and it's still standing today. It was their first center family dwelling. It was built in 1809, and then the last Shakers died out here in 1923, so they were here for a little over 100 years.
Whoa. On this 2,500-acre farm, they train oxen, make flat brooms and barrels, and cook up a darn good Shaker lemon pie. Save time for lunch and a cruise on the Shaker Village riverboat, Dixie Belle. Well, the Kentucky River was a key route to southern markets like New Orleans and played a crucial role in 19th century Shaker life. This is where they loaded the boats with the fruits of their labors, those flat brooms and their jams and jellies and garden seeds and livestock. Today, this old stern-wheeler meanders upriver loaded with tourists enjoying the fruits of their labor. Back on the trail, nearby Harrodsburg, is the oldest English settlement west of the Alleghenies. Visitors can picture its past in the reconstructed fort. And right across the street, Marty Williamson reminds you with her memories and songs that Appalachian life still thrives in Kentucky.
Kentucky, close your eyes and
For me, the old music is a window to the heart of Kentucky and to the descendants of the early settlers. Well, those pilgrims who made it over the Wilderness Road to Falls of the Ohio made it to Louisville, or Louisville as the locals call it. Well, the town happened because the falls that were created by these rock formations limited the easy movement of supplies and people on the river, and this became the end of the Wilderness Trail. By 1800, Louisville, Kentucky was about as far west as any settler could go. But Louisville's history is not all exploration. With the West open and the country temporarily at peace, America turned to leisure. As early as 1803, diaries refer to horse races that were usually held on plantations. Kentucky gentlemen were already shaping the horse tradition and the sport that became the Kentucky Derby. The history of horse racing in the state is told in the Kentucky Derby Museum. The other great American sport has an historic handhold here as well. This factory that's been making Louisville Slugger baseball bats for over 100 years. Stars from Babe Ruth to Ken Griffey Jr. have slugged their way into the fabric of America with these bats. Well, as we see, opening the Appalachians to wagon traffic meant expanding America's frontiers in ways that might have left Daniel Boone more bewildered than ever. We've traveled 1,000 miles from a Civil War battle to the end of the Wilderness Road, and even further from Shaker flat brooms to shiny new baseball bats. Next time, we'll head to the Old South and travel up the Mississippi River from New Orleans to Natchez. I'm Tom Bodette in Louisville, maybe a little bewildered myself, and thanks for joining us on America's Historic Trails.